I didn't get a chance to read the full prequel novella, The Sin of Deception, but I'm really liking it a lot so far.
That's great. I won't
I'm
give away
mostly
too many spoilers, but I'll do enough to talk about the book in depth.
yeah, I'm about I think 50% done in the book, but I do want to start by talking about like your background. And I love in the bio how you put that you took a 20-year hiatus into politics and then now you have become a published author. So it sounds like you wanted to become an author for some time and before you got into politics. So I was kind of curious how your political journey started and then what led you to walk away from it in 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess it would say that it started as a high school teacher. I was teaching literature in rural Pennsylvania, and really was passionate about teaching teenagers about Faulkner and Shakespeare and Arthur Miller. And one book in particular that I taught was Fahrenheit 451. Which has a great backstory. Ray Bradbury, some really cool science fiction, well ahead of its time. And just got very excited by this whole idea of, literature and literature that moves people and is part of a movement. And so while I was teaching, I got involved in some local politics and worked on a state house race as a volunteer. This would have been 20 years ago and just like knocked on the door of this campaign one day because I felt like I had this bug in me to be engaged and involved in politics in a more meaningful way. I had done some volunteer work in college too. So the campaign said, sure, like what would you like to do? And I said, well, whatever you need done. And pretty soon I was, mapping turnout strategies and I was mapping precincts and I was devising, canvas strategy and training volunteers to go knock on doors. And this was, completely volunteer prospect that turned into something of a passion. And, I continued to teach for a couple more years, but finally felt like I needed to go pursue this idea of, politics as a way to achieve some kind of reform in society and to see like the public good and to like elect good people. I think that's fundamentally was it about at the time was education reform and I was trying to support candidates who, had a similar worldview as I did. And um one thing led to another and I was, suddenly recruited to go work with the AFL-CIO and leave teaching altogether. And it was a tough decision because I'd gone to school and gone to college to become a teacher. And at the time, the statistic was like 65% of new teachers won't see their fifth year in public teaching. And I thought I would never be part of that statistic. And I was. And it was shocked to realize that I was. But it was for a lot of reasons. It wasn't because I was a bad teacher. I felt like I was a great teacher. I got a lot of commendation as a teacher and changed a lot of lives in the short time that I taught. But by leaving teaching and going to work for the AFL-CIO, it opened up a whole new world of opportunity for me to work in politics and became 20 years of working on campaigns and working in electoral politics, working to elect people to Congress and to the US Senate, and even worked on presidential campaigns. I myself ran for office several times. I won, I lost. Um, so that's how I came to, really enjoy a career in politics until the last, let's say, about 6 years. Things have started to take a slide in a different direction for me personally. And starting to feel like the sun was setting on the time I wanted to devote a full-time career to politics, and we could talk more about that. But after that kind of came to an end, I went back to something that I had been writing when I was a teacher, and that was this novel, and kind of pulled it back out of a drawer and gave it another read. It was terrible. The concepts were good; it had good bones, but there was no meat on those bones, and started to delve into the craft of writing more and kind of dusted off my credentials as an English teacher and thought maybe I could give this writing thing another go. And so that's for the last year been kind of reinvigorating the writing side of my DNA and now publishing my first book. And it's been a really exciting and challenging year.
Yeah. What have been like the biggest changes for you that were like the ones that you're like, okay, I can't do this anymore in politics? Like, what were some of the things where you're just like, I need to just walk away, like this is the last straw kind of thing?
Yeah. In 2006, 2007, 2008, there were still people on both sides of the political spectrum in America that were willing to work together and listen to one another and not demonize. And so I was someone who found it possible, especially working for the AFL-CIO, to work with Democrats and Republicans and independents, and found that there was, as long as we were focused on the issues and the parties didn't matter, because at the end of the day, we're trying to get good policy done. And it was about 2010 when things really started to become acrimonious, to the point that people started talking in terms of enemies, not just opponents. And I started to see the campaigns that I was working for come under more personal attack by their opponents, or wage more personal attacks against the people they're trying to beat in elections, to such a degree that it made you feel dirty in being part of it. And I think the last straw finally came for me when I ran the last time in 2019. I felt like I had, really seen and done a lot in politics. And while I maybe had some very high aspirations personally, I knew that they might come at tremendous sacrifice, and not sure that was something I was committed to personally, was that level of sacrifice, putting your entire life, out there for everyone to criticize, or to be fair game for an opponent to come after, not just your, the issues you stood on, but where did your mom go to school, and what type of, childhood did you have, and was that good or bad? And so in 2019, I ran for a county office, and the election was very close. This was the second time I ran for that office. The first time I had lost the primary. This time I won the primary, first place, and was going into the general election. And out of 50,000 votes, I lost by 199. And I would rather be blown out of the water than
Mhm.
lose by such a close margin, because it makes you just second guess. But the attacks were so personal, and the people who, teamed up to beat you didn't do that because of policy disagreements. It was all personality, and it was a lot of just categorical things that I felt like, I just could not be part of. I didn't want to devote my life and what, you know, energy I had to be part of something that made me feel so awful every day that I was involved in. And it did not have that same sense of reward and accomplishment and success and like genuine, like I said, wasn't no longer redeemable, right? It just felt like it was just a means to an end. It was
Mhm.
more entirely about the pursuit of power for people than about the policy. And I had always gotten into it from the start about the policy. And during one of the last debates for my race in 2019, I was debating the other candidates, and it was I had prepared, and I was sitting in front of this audience and giving heartfelt answers, and all of my opponents were reading their answers from papers in front of them, because they either didn't know the answers or didn't care to memorize their answers. And
Jeez.
at that moment, I felt like, I don't, it doesn't matter to me if I win or lose, because I know that I did the very best that I could, and I was always true to myself. And if I was going to be beat by folks who couldn't even answer honestly enough that they had to write their answer down like that for some basic things, so be it. And they all won and I lost. And so I've turned the page, and I feel better for it, because I feel like I'd be more true to myself, and now pursue this other passion that feels, something that's very exciting.
Yeah, and even from like an outsider perspective, like with me, I have not been involved in politics, but I listen to like a lot of political commentary. I watch the news a lot, and I just see like how much it's changed and just how it's more divisive now in the last 10 years, maybe more than 10 years, than it has when I was growing up. Growing up, I started coming of age when Bush was president, so it was like, 17, 18. But even then, it wasn't as much as like divisive as it is now.
Yeah, and I think that's something I'm tackling in this series, in the Bull Moose series, is, what is the consequence of a nation where the politics gets more and more divisive in that the good people, the people who have redeemable qualities, if they all part ways with democracy and politics and public policy and no longer seek office or can't, who are you left with? And what are the
Mhm.
consequences of that? And it's been fun and scary to explore those questions as an author.
Yeah, and I do love how in the Senate deception, from what I've read, it's like you don't exactly say Jackson Piper's a Democrat or this person's a Republican. You say the opposition party. You always say like the opposition party or something to where it doesn't specify what they are. And I was curious how like the importance of not assigning specific political parties to those characters was for you when making this book.
Yeah, and I got that inspiration from Alan Drury, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning author and one of the authors that has influenced me. And he wrote a really great novel in the 50s called Advise and Consent. And it was about the procedures of the Senate and about, a very contentious confirmation battle, talking about communism back in those days and the
Mhm.
Red Scare. And he talked about his parties as conservative and liberal, or his politicians as being conservative liberal. But back in those days, you could be a conservative and still be a Democrat, or you could be a liberal and still be a
Mhm.
Republican. It's not like that anymore. So for me, I wanted to try to keep my audience from turning off to Jackson because of their own political identity coming into the book. So if it wasn't obvious from the start that he was in the same party as the reader or not, then I really am trying to play with this idea that people can look at Jackson Piper through their own lens and decide, is he more like them or not like them politically? And the issues that matter 20 years in the future, some of them are foreign to us and some of them are still very relevant to us. But what I'm trying to do is show that there will be a future where maybe the party identification does not matter anymore as much as the values that are behind the people in those parties. And so that's why I've been really trying in this series to make the name of the parties irrelevant to some extent. Now, in the next book, Bull Moose, the Bull Moose Party itself becomes very important to the driving, factor of the story. But I wanted to play with that and see how the audience, came to either love Eileen Fraser or not like Eileen Fraser, or Mark Merriweather or Jackson Piper based on the stances they take and their characters and how the story evolves, rather than labeling them early in the story and then having the reader just shut down because in this moment where we live, the reader's a Republican and Jackson identifies as a Democrat in the book. If I would have written it that way,
Mhm.
would they just not see him as their hero? So I'm trying to play with that. Now there is some danger in writing political fiction, political thrillers, because you can, if you try to write for everyone, you end up writing for no one. So I've got to find a way to have an audience and to have some readership that does identify with what Jackson stands for. And I'm trying to do that in a way that I identify with, which is I feel like I'm a little partyless at the moment. So, I'm trying to pull some of those sympathies into Jackson and putting them to the extreme in the novel.
Yeah, I think that's got to be really difficult just to kind of see like how you can have the same values as someone, but like once you get that party identification or party affiliation label, then it's like, oh, immediate turn off. It almost seems
Right.
like that way with a lot of things that are going on right now. And so I think it's really smart that you're not exactly assigning them like, oh, this person's this party, this person's that party. And one thing that I did like was actually the Bull Moose Party was something back in the 1900s, early 1910s. And so I was kind of curious, like, what made you decide to go with the Bull Moose Party, even though no one's really affiliated with the Bull Moose Party so far in the series? What made you decide to bring that into your story?
Yes, that's a great question. And I'm a history nerd as much as I am a recovering English teacher. And when I was writing the Bull Moose book back in 2004, at that moment I was still looking at it. It was politics was not like it is today, right? There was some partisanship, but it was not like we find in 2024. Um, but I was exploring this idea that politicians, we have become a little too hot, cold, white, black, um, two-dimensional in political thinking in the United States. And so I wanted to explore this idea that there could be a viable third possibility that isn't just seen as centrist, because that's, I think, the real challenge. And even in this election we're going through right now in the United States, there's this discussion of the left and the right and then the center, as if there's only those three dimensions possible in a political ideology. And it makes for people, to really just pick a side and stay there. And so I was trying to find a way to write for an exciting, innovative time when a third party stepped forward and changed the landscape and did it in a way without being simply centrist as a rail post between, two opposing sides, but actually became a mix of the two parties, and also, came at them from their own flanks. And the progressives of 1912 did that. They took a lot of the tenets of reform, a reform agenda, and carried it forward. And they were talking about things that are now just commonplace, like direct primaries, right? Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, party bosses picked the nominees. It wasn't a primary election that did it. And it was the progressives and the bull mooses who advocated for the direct primary system that eventually led to the complete reforms by 1974. You have both parties picking their presidential nominees and their nominees for any other office through direct election primaries. They also advocated for the direct election of senators and against the trusts. And they also had advocated in 1912 for popular referenda on Supreme Court decisions, right? So something that is really wild and never came to fruition. And so you wonder, well, how did this former Republican president take such a progressive stance that might seem really liberal, right? So it was really interesting to me to see this multidimensional party come forward, and it was championed. And the story that you kind of read through history is, a lot of people say, well, it's just Teddy Roosevelt's ego, wanting another run at the presidency, and so he went co-opted the Bull Moose party. But it's not it at all. There was actually a very viable progressive movement. His celebrity that basically gave it the jet fuel that made it the most successful third party run ever since Lincoln, and his party was a third party back in those days. And no third party has been successful since. So he won like 86 or 88 electoral votes in 1912. And the other thing that I think is interesting, though, is it basically gave the election to Woodrow Wilson by siphoning all the votes away from President Taft. So that's the other thing I'm trying to explore in the book is, how do you have a viable third party that doesn't just siphon from a singular party and elect the other, but actually can create a multi-dimensional political spectrum in the United States and attract people to it and then be lasting? And that's the thing that the progressives did not do. They didn't survive. There was one progressive bull moose senator in the Senate. There was about a dozen bull moose members of the House. And by 1916, they had all switched back to Republicans. So what I'm exploring is the book is, if things are so corrupt and so bad, does the Bull Moose Party become a new powerful outlet? And is it transformative enough to change the way politics is conducted, to confront this terrible, violent, grievance, anger politics that is the politics of destruction, and to come back to something that is definitely based on values and based on morals and based on respect for the law and for the country? And does it attract enough citizens in the election process that people actually want to stay with it? And that's the essence of the Bull Moose novel.
Yeah, and actually, just talking about like the third parties, I am kind of curious on how it's going to be this year with RFK Jr. and him. I think it's the We the People Party is what he has, but he's running as independent, if I'm
Yeah.
understanding correctly. But
Yeah.
I'm really curious how it's going to change politics going into the future if, like, by happenstance, he's successful and wins the presidency.
Yeah, it's definitely intriguing. And one of the things I think is actually the greater circumstance is the contingent election, which is what it takes to kill a bull moose, the novel that follows the Senate deception. The final act of the novel is exploring what is a contingent election and how is it run. And the last time one was run for the presidency, interestingly enough, you had Andrew Jackson winning the popular vote and John Quincy Adams. They were locked in this race where neither one of them won a majority of electoral college. They go into the contingent election in that following year, and the House elects John Quincy Adams on the first ballot.
Mhm.
And this is where the states vote by delegations and they vote by secret ballot. And it's all this really wild stuff that I think most Americans have no knowledge of. And in fact, is probably the most likely scenario we'll face in 2025 should this election continue to shape like it is. It's very possible that none of the three candidates gets an outright majority, because when you have a multi-party presidential election, no one winning the majority is the most likely scenario. And therefore, it would go to the House to elect the president and the Senate to elect the vice president. And that's also strange because you could have the House elect a Republican and the Senate elect a Democrat. And then that could also be very wild in terms of precedent. So it's something that I explore in the novel, and it also presents a lot of opportunity for further corruption, right? Because
Mhm.
those rules are not in the Constitution. The rules of the contingent election are written by the House, and as we're seeing right now, the House is a very disorganized place. So, who is the Speaker of the House is paramount in running the contingent election, because that Speaker will determine the rules. For example, will the debate by each delegation be public or not? In the last contingent election, they were not. They were closed door debates and secret ballots that they came out of a room and handed their ballot box to the speaker, and they tabulated them and determined how each state had voted. So those rules will be written by the next speaker. So that's something I explore in the novel, is when people get wind of all the power that these individuals will have, people will stop at nothing, to claim power. And that's kind of one of the themes of the novel, is like, well, what are the limits? What are the limits? What are the moral limits of seeking power? And what happens if only amoral people are in the ring? What happens then?
Yeah. Now, when it came to writing the novella, and then the What It Takes to Kill a Bull Moose, and having it revolve around the world of politics, how challenging was it for you to craft something that could be accessible to everyone and not just have it be something that only political insiders would be able to understand?
That's a great question, and something I struggled with a lot in the scent deception. I've really been pleased to hear some readers come back and say, um, I did not know anything about the US Senate, but I felt like I learned something by reading the Senate deception. But at the same time, I didn't get lost at any point, because I did enough to like explain without it, being obvious that I was explaining what was going on. And then I had a reader from South Africa write me and say they loved my writing style, but they were lost because they knew nothing about the US Senate as being a South African. So, it's a double-edged sword. I think what's most important for me is to make sure that the my writing is character driven. And so to really hone in on Ziggy and really hone in on Ron Bender and make it more about their reactions and their feelings in the moment. And I think as someone who's worked in politics for 20 years, it does give me a little bit of heartburn when I do have to skip all the really important stuff. As Alfred Hitchcock said, that great stories, great writing, great movies are real life with all the boring parts taken out. And politics is a lot of boring parts. And so sometimes you have to skip over the process stuff. And as a political actor, I worry, do people think that I don't know, right? That this has to go to committee here or there. Sometimes you just have to take liberties for the sake of moving the story along. But I do feel like I have an obligation to get the history right, because it is a little bit of speculative fiction in that the characters have a shared history with us. They live in our world until their world takes over. So they have to get some of the things consistently right for history. And it's also important that it not be um, ridiculous. I don't want anyone who works in politics to read the Senate deception and feel like it's a farce, like that could never happen. And I've also had several friends who work on the Hill read it and love it. So it's made me feel good that I got it good enough that even members who people who work in the Senate, maybe not Senate, I have no knowledge that a US senator has read it yet, but people who work in the US Senate have read it and said they like it. They like it a lot. It captures the essence of how that body operates.
And I'm sure that was something else as well, because I know people who work in fields such as law enforcement or fire, they have trouble watching movies or reading books that are set in those worlds, but are fictional because of the fact that they don't interpret everything correctly how it should be. And so I'm sure for you, when it came to like giving out to colleagues or people that you know who work in the political world, there was probably some uncertainty on how they would understand or not understand it, but receive it because of the fact that maybe it doesn't relate to that or be realistic in one way, or maybe it's too realistic in another way, or something like that.
Exactly right. And I feel like I've had great political movies spoiled for me because it was just unbelievable what happened,
Mhm.
right? So I just like that could never happen. So like for me, I'm very conscious of that, but it could also be very boring if you make it strictly realistic. So maybe like you think about House of Cards or The West Wing, they
Mhm.
find ways to make it believable enough, but then add some fantastical elements to keep the story interesting. So but like, I was stuck at different parts of the Senate deception, and a friend of mine was counseling me. He's like, well, you're not gonna write this story showing them like going and knocking on every door, right? To get every vote like you would in a campaign. You have to kind of skip ahead to those other really exciting parts. And that's, it's a 300-page book. You can't make it 10,000 pages, no one will read it. So you've got to find the right way. And I think you just try to pick those little snippets of life that actually move the story along. That either show the
Right.
conflict and provide setback to the heroes, or they show some other really exciting, energy that's going to drive the plot forward. So, but realism, maintaining some realism is really important to me in my writing in terms of political fiction.
I saw this was initially there was a Kickstarter for this book, but it didn't get fully funded. Is the book still on track to come out May 14th, or what are the changes that have happened since the Kickstarter didn't get fully funded?
Yeah, I'm pushing back, I think, to June 14th. I'm going to go back one more month. It'll give me a little bit more time to get my own revisions done and get everything
Mhm.
uploaded to where I need to go. And being a first-time author, I have been absolutely, so thankful to sites like authormedia.com and the Novel Marketing Podcast. They have really helped me understand this process of, getting myself to be an independently published author. But even though there are so many things to do, there's just about a certain amount of time you have in a day to get all the work done. So the biggest thing right now, the biggest hurdle is all this editing, because I don't want in the full length novel, I can't allow myself to have the same types of errors or problems that I had with the novella. So I want to definitely try to get this a very clean copy, and it's a much larger undertaking to get a full novel published because so many plot lines, a little more artwork involved. And there's also the whole essence of, you want people to buy it. So you've got to, set it up in a way, launch in a way that builds anticipation and excitement. So June 14th is the new target date I'm looking. It's still going to be in time for the summer reading season, still in time for the presidential election. People will be wondering, what is a contingent election, and what does all this matter? So I hope that I'm still relevant if I'm launching in June.
And one of the things I actually read in your bio was as the time went on and like there were more things that were coming to life that happened in your book. I'm curious now, like if you were to have it published and maybe people see it as, oh, are you just basing it on something that already happened, or but you already had this idea beforehand? So I'm kind of curious, like, what people may think when you write it, and then all the ideas that have already happened were actually thought of, years prior.
Well, and that's the problem I had with the Bull Moose novel itself,
Hmm.
because I wrote that in 2004, 2005. And the way the story unfolded was a little more focused on terrorism, okay, because it was a little more focused in 2001, post 9/11. But at the end of the original Bull Moose novel, there was a scene that unfolded that was very reminiscent of January 6th. And so impossible for me to make this highly tense moment, this dramatic moment in the novel that I had written be something fantastical when it in fact had come to life. So
Mm,
similarly, I went back to the drawing board, rewrote the book to be not focused on terrorism, but focus more on this question of political violence that's going on right now, and this the extremes we're seeing it from folks, and then coming up with a new ending that has the next level of, well, what if type of questions being asked. I think it's really important to me to not fall in the trap of trying to predict, right? I don't want the story to simply be like people come back to me and say, "Oh, you were right, Michael. You predicted all this stuff would happen." But I do want it to have enough of a plausible warning type of track to it to say, yes, these are the types of things that will happen if we keep going down this path of one extreme over the next extreme over the next. Um, so I am very cognizant of that, and I'm also trying to get the book published in time for this election season because I feel like the novel is about a presidential election. I feel like people are going to want to read a novel about presidential politics who read that type of literature this year. And the plan is for the Tree of Liberty, which is going to be the sequel, to release in 25, and that's going to release um, to the next is going to be like the kind of the next iteration of governing, right? Is the Bull Moose coalition comes together. And so as we turn the page away from election and into governing in 25 and 26, I'm hoping that I can also ride the tide of people wanting to talk about governing in 25 and 26.
yeah. Um, who have been some of the authors that you admire and have inspired you to take this next step in becoming an author yourself?
Yeah, I would really point to authors like Dan Brown, um, Dan Silva, Alan Drury. Um, some of their literature and their writing is it captivates me. It makes me want to sit on the beach and have a book in my hand, and while I'm in that beautiful scene, have my eyes on the page reading words. Um, also Agatha Christie and her mystery writing. Like there's an element I want to surprise my reader as they turn the page and say, "I didn't see that coming," type of thing. So I'm trying to blend some of these genres together. And as much as I would love to write a Tolkien style or a Witcher style series, I would love to write some sci-fi. I'm just not quite ready for that yet. Feel like I got to get some other writing under my belt. And so politics is what I knew, and I felt like I could start there and maybe do a little bit of fantastical world building in the world of politics in the process. But what I love about writers like Dan Brown and Silva is, their novels are just full of action, and they're thrillers. They drive very quickly. And so I'm trying to make my chapters move quickly and trying to drive action quickly. So you're just moving from the next scene to the next scene. And so in the Senate deception, except for when they're having the Senate debate, it moves very quickly through the novel from one scene to the next. And those are definitely people who influence me. And they're character-driven stories. You really
Mhm.
identify with a driving character in those stories who the world is built around. And for me, that's going to be Jackson Piper. And there's a character you're going to meet in the What It Takes to Kill a Bull Moose, Valerie Lawrence, and she becomes this embodiment of Teddy Roosevelt in many ways. She's this rough and tumble Texas governor who's breaking molds, and she's more of the bull moose than he is. And so I'm really been excited to write her, and can't wait to see where she goes in the next couple novels.
Right. Yeah, definitely looking forward to that when the What It Takes to Kill a Bull Moose comes out, if I can even say that correctly. Um, so what do you say to the person who's like wanting to become a published author but has had like numerous setbacks and kind of keeps putting the book aside and doesn't know what the next step is, and their time keeps going by? What do you say to them when they want to actually get the book out and be able to publish it?
Yeah, I would say find your tribe. I mean that in two ways. It's something I've learned through listening to the Novel Marketing Podcast and Thomas Upstat Jr. Is find that group of people you want to write for and figure out what really excites them. And if you want to write fiction or you want to write nonfiction as a pastime, then don't worry about your audience, but also don't worry about it becoming a vocation, right? You're going to basically just write for the creative process. But if you want to write marketable, profitable, commercially available print, then I do think you've got to figure out who you're writing for and talk about what makes them tick and what drives them, what excites them, and write for them. And I think that's really important to do. And then I would advise anyone who wants to explore writing part-time or full-time to know that it is a challenging experience. And so if you also have a tribe of people who are in the boat with you, they can cheer you on when you feel hopeless or when you feel all your writing is total crap and you think it should just be thrown away. They'll say, we've all been there. We've all felt that. And, you know, it's not crap. It's going to be all right. Um, I think it really helps because writing can be so lonely. It can be such a lonely prospect to sit in a room alone and stare at the screen. If you've got people who are in similar experience and can provide some mentorship and coaching. And so there are a lot more writing groups out there than I realized when I first started writing. So I've been able to connect with like pen writers in Pennsylvania and some others and some local meetups, people who are writing and just, sharing pages and, getting critiques back on, is this working? Is this not working? The worst thing to do as a writer is to write in a vacuum and think, that you're going to be able to do it all, critique yourself, edit yourself. You can't do that. You need other humans, and AI. That's helpful too. But you need other humans to help you work out the difficulties and find the traps and figure it out. And, it's also because of all of this amazing technology that's happened in the past 15 years, it's more attainable than ever for anyone with great writing abilities to sit in a computer terminal and publish. So just figuring out what are the mechanics behind ISBNs and, layouts and covers and back cover copy. You can learn the art behind those things, then it is very possible to become a published author. Time is the biggest commitment.
All right. Well, Michael, thank you so much for taking the time. Where can people go to find you and find out more about your books and what you have coming up in the future?
Absolutely, David. Thanks for having me on. It's been great. So you go to michaelfedorbooks.com. That's like the hat without the A, Michael, Fedor books.com. And you can find me there. You can find all my social channels on my website. And my book table has The Scent Deception. It has What It Takes to Kill a Bull Moose. And very soon we'll have links for some other books that will be coming out in 25.
Great. Well, again, thank you for the time. It was great talking to you, and I'll reach out when everything gets put together.
Can't wait to hear it. Thanks again for the opportunity. Good luck to you.
Yeah, good luck to you as well. All right, have a good
Thanks.
day.
You too.